In the last video we fitted the Ruffstuff frame stiffeners to the centre part of the chassis on the vehicle. I haven't done the front yet. It's in this box just behind me here. That'll be coming up in future episodes, but first we need to finish off the centre of the vehicle. You saw what I did to the other side. I cut out the rusty sill, put in 2x6 box section, tied that back to the stiffener, which can be directly welded to now because of its thickness. And all in all, I gained a stronger sill without any problem areas that are going to rust out like the old one, and a slider that's tied in to the stiffener, so it's a really strong area now on the vehicle. But I've got the box section over here and we're going to get started with cutting the sill out. And this is what we're looking at here. This is the new sill that's going to be going in, and this is precisely 67.5 inches long. From arch to arch right to the end, it's a full length replacement, and you're looking at collectively a piece of 2x6 box section. I've obviously given it a good clean down and used weld through primer on it as well. Although you can see in my case I've actually got a piece of 2x4 and just put an extra piece on the side just to make it up to 2x6, and there's a valid reason for that in my case, so I wouldn't advise you do it. I'd just go get a piece of 2x6 to the right length. I suppose the positives of having two pieces of box like this as strength: you've now got an inner wall that can't be twisted and contorted as easily as if it was just hollow, but at the same time the disadvantages are you've got to make the thing up and weight. So it may seem like I'm charging into something pretty sketchy here, cutting out a sill on a vehicle and welding in box section. It's all pretty extreme, but I got my inspiration to do this from Matt from Bleep Jeep. He's got a video where he it shows you how to do this as well, and I was looking for a solution for my rusty sills and I spotted that video, and it's actually quite a common modification. A lot of people do this to this particular vehicle. It's not just something I'm doing of my own creation. You know, I've looked at loads of tutorials out there online. Lots of people have done it, so if you are interested in doing this, you can always Google it and have a look, and you'll probably find quite a lot of guidance out there. But I'm just going to take this disc cutter, and where we're going to cut is just literally below that lip there. I'm probably going to drop down about 0.5 centimetre and cut all the way along, and I'm going to leave the plastic arches on for now because I'm actually going to cut them too. So I'm underneath the vehicle. You can see where I've made a cut along there. That's the bottom of the door. This is the sill, and it's this portion here that we want to be removing. This is the flange or pinch weld, where two pieces of metal are connected together, so this is spot welded all the way along. This is the bit that always rots. Water gets in between the two pieces of metal. There's very little paint in there. It's a problem area on a lot of old vehicles. And where we're going to cut is, if you see this flat piece of metal here, this is the floor pan, and this is kind of the beginning of the sill, this line here. I'm drawing with my finger. So what we need to do is go in about 1/2 inch and cut all the way along there like that, leaving ourselves just 1/2 inch of metal here to hammer against the box section and weld with. Well, that's the sill cut out. In the middle It's fairly rust free, and you can see the Dinitrol wax line the inside. I did that a while ago and that saved it from getting any worse. The front was a little bit tricky to cut because you've got some thick joins in there and bolts, but you just have to get through it and put any metal back if you cut too much away. The back end is where it's rusty on mine, but it's not rusted through and it's still pretty structural, and the gauge of steel is thick enough that it's just surface rust. So you can see the prep work I've done there. We've cleaned this lip here that will be directly welded to. We've cleaned under here as well, this lip there. Inside has been cleaned up to about there because obviously we don't want the wax dripping down. We did have a little bit of pitting and rust at the bottom there, but I've just wire brushed that out very aggressively. I'm not too fussed about that, as this will be pumped full of cavity wax, which is got good rust inhibitors in it anyway, so it shouldn't get any worse. The back is where the real rust was. We were fine on the outside. You can see that's all been cleaned up and looking good. But inside here we did have some rust and even a repair that someone had done some time ago. So I've just cleaned that up as best I can. The metal's still good, you know, and this is fine. It's pretty solid. I'm just going to patch that up with some filler. I'm not particularly too worried about it. I may have to come back to it in years to come, but for the time being, it'll be okay. So that's about equal now, and we've got just past an inch of protrusion past the doors, and that isn't really a lot. You'd be better off with something like 2x8, and a lot of people usually recommend that. 2x6 is okay though, and what I intend to do is actually get some tubing and have it coming out another 2 inches all the way along here and bending back in and a support in the middle. And that was the long-term goal. Whether we'll do that before the trip, I don't know. Maybe I'll have to do it after. But for the time being, this is obviously a strong base to then work from, which is the reason I'm doing it. So we're going to get this tack welded in now, and then start hammering the metal back underneath that we bent back, and then tack weld that in as well. So you can see what I've done there. I've hammered back that lip we created just to make it flush. It needs hitting again in a couple of places before we weld it in permanently. I've spot welded it in and we're ready to weld this on now. And I've just started with my first weld here. Started off a little bit ropey, started blowing some holes in it, found it a bit difficult actually, but I managed to get things to kind of progress a bit better. So I'll carry on welding this in, and hopefully as we go through it I can improve a bit. Well, the new sill or the slider is welded in. I couldn't film too much of that. It was very challenging. I found that pretty difficult. I don't do too bad when I'm on the bench and I've got two pieces of metal in front of me and they're thick. It's not as difficult, but you're welding a 3mm piece of box section to a really thin body panel. And the way I was taught was you focus on the thick metal and then gradually pull into the thinner metal, and that worked a lot of the time, but sometimes it just wouldn't flow right and it would get really spitty. And I don't know whether it's just this weld through primer, which, I mean, maybe it isn't, or maybe it's just me, maybe I'm just not that good at welding. But I had some good runs, and overall it's structural. I've continuously welded all the way along here, into the front arch, into the rear arch, and all the way along the bottom. So we'll get those legs made, and then I'll hide my shame with P38. So all 4 supports are installed. I had to build some 1/2-inch spacers for the 2 supports at the front, simply because the chassis moves like an S-bend, the floor pan sags down in certain areas. They're not all going to go in the same way, and they've all come out quite well. I've got 2 fairly close together at the front, and then 2 a little bit more spaced apart at the back to match the other side, and that's kind of how I want them to be. And you're not actually going to see them anyway, because we're going to have a skid plate underneath here eventually. Prior to that, a splash plate made of aluminium that will cover them up. But I've cleaned all this down now with degreaser, and I'm ready to use P38, which is a filler, to basically protect all of the welds, or hide them in my case, and do the same underneath. And it just means that, much like the other side, it almost looks like it's come from the factory. So I've finished using seam sealer and P38. I like to use the seam sealer first because it's a lot thinner. It's more like a grease, whereas P38's like almost like clay. And it's gone on nicely, and this needs to harden now. I'll come back tomorrow, check it out, and then we'll see if we can prime and paint it. We're a few days on from when the filler and the seam sealer were applied, and I left it about 3 days, made sure it was completely dry, and then sanded it down smooth, and then zinc primed the whole area, even the filler. Any bare metal's been zinc primed, underneath all the legs have been zinc primed, and then I let that set for about a day and a half, and then satin blacked the whole thing. And then just while the satin black was tacky, I used a bed liner just to give the satin black a bit of texture. You remember in the last video as well, we used the Dinatrol cavity wax hose with the diffuser on the end, with the remaining holes along the top that will soon to be filled. I used the cavity wax hose in there and filled the whole sill and lined it with cavity wax, so all the bare metal in there will be covered now. But I had some spare aluminium, and I decided to take that aluminium to the fabricators and get them to put a 45-degree bend just on the edge of it. And I made like a splash plate just to go underneath the actual vehicle. But the idea of this was just to stop lots of mud and grit and all sorts of rubbish getting up into those supports and basically hitting the bottom of the undercoat on the floor pan and gradually wearing it away. So it just protects that investment I've just put into all of that section just there. And the way you fit that splash pan is obviously quite important. I've got it separated with 1/2 inch and 1 inch spacers, so it actually mounts under the vehicle at a slight slant like that, and there's a gap just between the actual sill and the splash plate, so I can see down into it, get the pressure washer in there, just blast anything out. And I left a gap between the actual splash plate and where the frame ends, so it means that everything can just run down and drop out. I've tied it into the front mud flap. I've also extended the rear DIY wheel well, so that connects to like a kind of splash plate as well that wraps around the underneath of the aluminium plate, and it means it's fully protected. And we'll see how it does. Hopefully it'll be okay. But my advice to people who would be building a vehicle like this for a rock crawling purpose, maybe out in the States a lot of people rock crawl with Cherokees, I'd say that I just wouldn't bother with any of that, and probably even do a different design of the actual supports that I've made, because you know, they're just going to get hung up on rocks. You probably just want to mount a 1/2 inch thick plate like this from the sill to the frame, so it acts as a skid plate but also supports the two pieces together, so they're tied together nicely. But it's all looking real good, and I've undertaken another massive project now. Once this is done, a friend of mine's helping with a set of drawers in the back and some shelving and a table that will come out the back. We've got all the gear, we've got the stoves, I've got new suspension to go in, new shocks, I've got strengthened steering arms, I've got to redo all the bearings, I've got U-joints to put in. Some of this I'm not going to be able to film. I know some of you are interested in this build, others probably not. In fact, most of the people who watch my channel probably aren't, but it is a part of the process, and we're going to be living in this for 6 months, and we move out of our home in 2 weeks. I mean, our possessions have basically been reduced down to a few boxes, and everything else has gone to charity shops, and we've sold it. So, you know, it's kind of mounting up, and it's weighing on top of me a little bit. Actually, I'm starting to think, what the hell am I doing? And Megan is as well. But it should be an exciting trip, and you know, it's just the sense of freedom being on the road in the Jeep. We've got the roof tent, it's actually in the back of the Jeep, so we'll see how it goes. But you can see the front there of the vehicle, it's all stripped down, ready for the front frame stiffener, and I'll get that sorted and then get the front rebuilt, and then the vehicle's pretty much almost ready. So I hope you enjoyed this video, I appreciate you watching, and I'll see you very soon in another one. Take care guys, thanks again. Now if you made it this far, you've seen me use a ton of filler 2 years ago when I did that mod, and what I will say is that is not what I would recommend to anybody out there. I had loads of trouble with the filler cracking, and if you watched this next video I'm going to put up somewhere at the top here and in the description, you'll see the result of what happened with that job I did, and that it went wrong. And essentially it went wrong where I used too much filler, and the flexing of the vehicle cracked the filler, water got underneath it, and I had to pull all that filler off, clean everything back, and then obviously I got it wrapped aligned and did a proper job that time and learned from my mistakes. So if you've watched this video to the end, obviously ignore that part of the tutorial, do not do what I did, learn from my mistakes, and you know, don't use a lot of filler. I mean, it was the first time for me using a lot of filler. I thought it would be okay, I thought it would be flexible, I should have known better really, but you know, mistakes happen. But thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon in another video. Take care.